The silence in my car was the only thing I owned. It was a thick, suffocating blanket of quiet as I drove, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I had no destination. I was just moving, putting miles between myself and the wreckage of the life I had just left behind. My daughter-in-law's voice was a venomous echo in my head, her words replaying on a cruel, endless loop. Desperate failure, worthless, pathetic. She had laughed as she said it, a sharp, ugly sound that had flayed the skin from my heart. But it was my son's voice that had truly destroyed me. When I had gone to him, my own child, his eyes had slid away from mine, his face a mask of impatient annoyance. "Mom, you're imagining things," he'd sighed. "You always exaggerate." In that moment, after 40 years of sacrifice, of pouring my life and my savings into his, he had not just failed to defend me, he had called me a liar. He had chosen his wife's cruelty over his mother's truth. So I walked out. I got in my car and I drove. And in the humming silence of the highway, I blocked his number, I blocked hers, and I began to make a new plan. Before I begin, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. My name is Patricia Williams. For 40 years I was a postal worker, a wife, and a mother. I believed that my worth was measured by how much I could give to my family. This is the story of how I learned that your true worth is only revealed when you finally learn to say no. The argument, like most of them, had started over something small, something meaningless. A disagreement about where to hang a new picture in the living room of the house I had helped them buy. I was visiting for the weekend, as I often did. A visit that was less about family connection and more about my unspoken duties as the on-call babysitter and occasional housekeeper. My son Michael had disappeared into his home office to take a work call, a common tactic he used to avoid any and all domestic conflict, leaving me alone with his wife, Monique. She had wanted the picture, a large, abstract, and ridiculously expensive piece of art hung over the fireplace. I had gently suggested that it might overwhelm the small room, that perhaps a different wall would be better. And that was all it took. My quiet, aesthetic opinion was the spark that ignited the inferno of her resentment. "Oh, I'm sorry," she'd said, her voice a symphony of the most poisonous, saccharine sweetness. "I forgot that you are the expert on taste. I mean, look at your own house. It's a museum of mediocrity. But I guess that's what happens when you spend your entire life licking stamps for a living." The cruelty of it, the sheer, unprovoked venom, was breathtaking. I stood there, in the middle of the living room her father-in-law's pension had paid the down payment for, and I felt the familiar hot flush of shame and anger rise in my cheeks. But I said nothing. I had learned over the years that engaging with Monique's cruelty was like wrestling with a pig in the mud. You both get dirty and the pig enjoys it. My silence, however, was not a deterrent. It was an invitation. She saw my quiet, wounded dignity as weakness, and she began to circle, a shark that had scented blood in the water. "It's just so sad, really," she continued, her voice a low, conspiratorial murmur, as if she were sharing a juicy piece of gossip with a friend. She began to pace the room, touching her expensive possessions, the things my money had bought, as if they were holy relics. "To get to your age, to have worked your whole life and to have so little to show for it. No real career. No real assets. Just a tiny little house and a government pension. It's the definition of a desperate failure, isn't it? To be so worthless." The words, desperate failure and worthless, hung in the air, two sharp poison darts. She was not just insulting me, she was trying to annihilate me, to erase the value of my entire life, a life of steady, quiet, and deeply honorable work. "And the worst part," she said, her voice dropping to a stage whisper, a look of performative pity on her face, "is the clinging. The way you're always here. The way you have to insert yourself into our lives because you don't have one of your own. It's pathetic, really. But I guess that's what we're for. Michael and I, we're your charity case. We're the only thing that makes your sad little life feel meaningful." She was laughing now, a soft, ugly, self-satisfied sound. She was so lost in her own performance, so intoxicated by the sound of her own cruelty, that she had not noticed the one small and catastrophic detail that would be her undoing. In the corner of the room, on the arm of the sofa, sat my 12-year-old grandson, Elijah. And in his hands he held his phone. And on the screen of that phone I could see the small, innocuous, and utterly devastating red icon that read, "Live." He was live streaming. To his small private world of school friends and online acquaintances, he was broadcasting his mother's vicious, private tirade. He was not being malicious. He was a child, a product of his generation, a boy who saw a dramatic, interesting moment and whose first and only instinct was to record it, to share it. He had no idea that he was not just creating content. He was creating evidence. He was creating the unimpeachable, irrefutable proof of the abuse I had been silently enduring for years. And in that moment my world, which had been shrinking under the weight of Monique's cruelty, suddenly, and with a terrifying, beautiful clarity, began to expand. The moment Monique swept out of the room, a triumphant, self-satisfied smirk on her face, I turned to my son. Michael had emerged from his office the second he heard his wife's footsteps receding down the hall, his timing as predictable as it was cowardly. He had, I knew, heard every word. He always did. He would just hide, letting the storm pass, and then emerge to clean up the emotional debris. Michael, I began, my voice a low, trembling thing, the shock of the verbal assault still ringing in my ears. Did you hear what your wife just said to me? He wouldn't meet my eyes. He busied himself with straightening a stack of magazines on the coffee table, his movements jerky, avoidant. I heard some yelling, he mumbled, his gaze fixed on the glossy cover of a home design magazine. You know how Monique gets. She's just stressed about the party we're hosting next week. Stressed. I repeated, my voice rising with a dawning, horrified disbelief. She called me a worthless, desperate failure, Michael. She said I was pathetic. That is not stress. That is abuse. He finally looked at me, his expression not one of concern or of anger on my behalf, but of a deep and profound annoyance. He looked at me as if I were the problem, as if my pain was an inconvenient interruption to his quiet, peaceful afternoon. Mom, come on, he said, his voice a weary, dismissive sigh. You're exaggerating. You know you have a tendency to take things to heart. Simone was probably just joking. You're being too sensitive. The words, the casual, dismissive, and utterly soul-crushing gaslighting of them, were a physical blow. He was not just failing to defend me, he was actively taking her side. He was invalidating my reality, my pain, my very perception of the world. He was telling me that the vicious, cruel, and deeply personal attack I had just endured was a figment of my oversensitive imagination. I am not imagining things, Michael, I said, my voice now as cold and as hard as the knot of ice that was forming in the pit of my stomach. And I am not exaggerating. Your wife, in this room just 5 minutes ago, systematically dismantled my entire life's worth with her words. And you are telling me I am being too sensitive. Look, he said, his voice taking on a wheedling, placating tone, the voice he used when he wanted a difficult conversation to end. I'll talk to her, okay? I'll tell her to tone it down. But you know how she is. She doesn't mean it. It's just how she talks. He was making excuses for her. He was normalizing her abuse. He was choosing the quiet, easy path of appeasing his monstrous wife over the difficult, necessary path of defending his own mother. And in that moment I knew with a certainty that was as absolute as it was heartbreaking, that I had lost him. He was no longer my son. He was her husband. And my place in his life, in his heart, was a distant and disposable second. The final, fatal blow was the live stream. She was being recorded, Michael, I said, my voice a low, desperate whisper, a last-ditch attempt to make him see the truth. Elijah was live-streaming the whole thing. There is proof. His eyes, which had been darting around the room, avoiding my gaze, finally went still. A flicker of something, not concern but a cold, calculating fear, crossed his face. He was not worried about my pain. He was worried about the consequences, about the public exposure of his wife's ugly, private behavior. And then he made his final, unforgivable choice. He chose the lie. Live streaming, he said, his voice a short, brittle, and deeply unconvincing laugh. Mom, what are you talking about? Elijah was playing a video game. I saw him. You must have been mistaken. You're just upset. You're not thinking clearly. He was denying the evidence of my own eyes. He was choosing to believe a convenient fiction over an inconvenient truth. He was not just my son, he was my enemy. He was a co-conspirator in my own abuse. And that was it. That was the moment the last, final, and most resilient thread of my maternal love finally snapped. I looked at the man standing before me, the man I had raised, the man whose life I had subsidized, and I saw a stranger. A weak, cowardly, and deeply disappointing stranger. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not argue. I simply, and with a quiet and terrible and deeply liberating finality, let him go. I turned, my movements slow and deliberate. I walked to the hall closet, the one where my coat and my purse were hanging. I took them out. I put on my coat. I slung my purse over my shoulder. And then, without another word, without another glance in his direction, I walked out the front door, got in my car, and drove away. I was not just leaving his house. I was leaving my old life, the life of the endlessly forgiving, endlessly generous, and endlessly foolish mother, behind forever. The drive was a blur. The familiar streets of my son's suburban neighborhood, the streets I had navigated 1,000 times on my way to babysit or to drop off groceries, now looked alien, hostile. Each well-manicured lawn, each perfect two-story colonial, seemed to mock me with its illusion of happy, normal family life. I drove with no destination, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my mind a chaotic, roaring sea of pain and rage. Monique's words were a venomous, echoing chorus in my head. Desperate failure, worthless, pathetic. But it was Michael's words, his casual, dismissive gaslighting, that were the true poison. You're exaggerating, you're being too sensitive, you're not thinking clearly. He had taken my pain and turned it into a symptom of my own weakness, my own instability. He had not just allowed the abuse, he had co-signed it. As the miles blurred past, the raw, chaotic emotion began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard, and deeply clarifying anger. And with that anger came memory. My life, my real life, the one they had so casually and cruelly dismissed, began to unspool in my mind. I remembered the long, grueling years after my husband had passed away, when Michael was still in college. I was working full-time at the post office, a physically demanding job, and I had taken on a second weekend job cleaning houses, just to make sure his tuition was paid, to make sure he could graduate debt-free. I remembered the exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of those years, an exhaustion I had borne gladly, proudly, because it was for my son. I remembered 5 years ago when he and Monique had wanted to buy their first house, the very house I had just walked out of. They had the ambition, but they didn't have the down payment. I had taken the money, a significant 5-figure sum from my own retirement savings, the nest egg I had so carefully and painstakingly built over 40 years of federal service. I had handed it to them, a gift, a foundation for their future. You don't have to pay me back, I had told them, my heart swelling with a foolish maternal pride. Just be happy. I remembered the car, the brand new, sensible, and yet still expensive SUV they drove. I had co-signed the loan, and for the past 3 years, as Michael's sales commissions had fluctuated, I had been the one making the monthly payments, a quiet, secret subsidy to their fragile middle-class lifestyle. The car, the house, the endless smaller infusions of cash for emergencies that were really just lifestyle upgrades. It was a river of money, a one-way flow from my life to theirs, a river that I had allowed to flow for years, fueled by a mother's blind and deeply misguided love. And what had I gotten in return? Not gratitude, not respect, not even a simple and decent inclusion in their lives. I had gotten exclusion. I had gotten condescension. I had gotten a daughter-in-law who saw me as a pathetic failure, and a son who saw me as a hysterical, exaggerating old woman. I had been a fool, a blind and willing fool. I had mistaken their dependence for love. I had mistaken their need for affection. I had been so desperate to be a part of their lives that I had allowed myself to become their personal, on-call, and deeply disrespected bank. I pulled the car over to the side of the road, the sudden, screeching halt a physical manifestation of the one that had just occurred in my own mind. I was done. The Bank of Mom was officially and permanently closed. I took out my phone, my hands steady now, my purpose clear. I scrolled to Michael's contact. I looked at the picture of him, a smiling, happy photo from a family vacation years ago, a vacation I had paid for. And then, with a calm, deliberate, and deeply satisfying finality, I pressed the block button. I did the same for Monique. I had not just blocked their numbers. I had blocked their access. To my money, to my home, to my life. I had just, with 2 simple taps on a screen, declared my own personal and long overdue independence. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the first clean, unpolluted breath I had taken in years. I did not know where I was going. But for the first time in a very long time, I knew that wherever it was, I was going there for me. I drove for another hour, the city lights giving way to the quieter, darker roads of the countryside. My mind, which had been a chaotic storm, was now a quiet, empty, and blessedly calm lake. I had no plan, no destination. I was simply moving, putting distance between myself and the woman I had been. And then a single clear and comforting thought rose to the surface. Dorothy. My cousin Dorothy Hall was more like a sister to me. She was 2 years older, a retired school principal, a woman of sharp and deeply unsentimental wisdom. She was the matriarch of our extended family, a woman who had seen it all and who had absolutely no tolerance for foolishness, especially the foolishness of men and of spoiled children. She had been biting her tongue for years about the way Michael and Monique treated me, her disapproval a silent, thunderous cloud at every family gathering. I found her number and I called. She answered on the first ring, her voice a familiar, no-nonsense bark. Patricia? Is that you? It's nearly 10 o'clock at night. Is everything all right? No, Dorothy, I said, my own voice a quiet, tired thing. It's not. But I think it's going to be. And then I told her everything. The words came out in a calm, steady, and emotionless stream. I recounted Monique's vicious tirade, Michael's cowardly betrayal, the final, devastating gaslighting. I told her about the live stream, about the drive, about the blocked numbers. I was not a victim telling a story of woe. I was a soldier reporting from the field of battle. Dorothy listened, her silence not the silence of shock, but of a deep and long-simmering vindication. When I was finished, she did not offer sympathy. She did not offer condolences. She offered a single beautiful and deeply, deeply satisfying word. Good, she said, her voice a low, triumphant growl. It's about damn time. You are finally done being their doormat. Her words, her fierce and completely unapologetic approval, were a balm to my raw, wounded soul. She was not just validating my anger, she was celebrating it. So where are you now? She asked, her voice shifting, becoming the voice of the principal who was now taking charge of a crisis. I don't know, I admitted. I'm on the highway somewhere north of the city. You turn this car around, she commanded, her voice a firm, unwavering order. And you drive straight to my house. The guest room is ready. You are not alone in this, Patricia. You hear me? You are staying with me. For as long as it takes. I don't want to be a burden, I whispered, the old, familiar habits of self-effacement dying hard. Don't you dare talk that nonsense to me, she snapped, her voice sharp with a fierce, protective love. You are not a burden. You're my family. The real kind. Now you get in this car and you drive. And when you get here, we are going to have a glass of sherry and we are going to make a plan. A plan to make sure that those ungrateful little monsters can never take another penny or another piece of your heart from you again. I hung up the phone, a wave of profound and deeply unfamiliar relief washing over me. I had a safe harbor. I had an ally. I had a home. I turned the car around and for the first time that day I knew exactly where I was going. I was going to my cousin's house. I was going to my war room. I was going home. The next morning I woke up in the quiet, sun-drenched guest room of Dorothy's house, a room that smelled of cedar and old, beloved books. For a long, disoriented moment I didn't know where I was. And then the events of the previous day came crashing back, a tidal wave of pain and humiliation. And with it came the doubt. Had I overreacted? Had I been too harsh? Had Michael been right? Was I just an oversensitive old woman, exaggerating a simple, thoughtless comment? The gaslighting, I realized, was a poison that worked even when the abuser was not in the room. I walked into the kitchen to find Dorothy sitting at her small oak table, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands, and a look of grim, righteous fury on her face. She was staring at her tablet, which was propped up against the sugar bowl. Good morning, soldier, she said, her voice a low, dangerous growl. I think you need to see this. She turned the tablet toward me. And on the screen I saw it. It was a link sent to her by our younger cousin, a woman who was more in tune with the world of social media. The link was to a video and the thumbnail was a picture of my own shocked and deeply pained face. The message from our cousin was simple. Auntie, I think you need to see this. This is the video of Monique going off on Aunt Patricia. Elijah's friend sent it to me. It's making the rounds at his school. My heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest, I pressed play. And I watched. I watched the entire excruciating 7-minute tirade. I saw Monique's sneering, contemptuous face, her eyes shining with a vicious, ugly glee. I heard her words not as a hazy, traumatic memory, but as a clear and undeniable audio recording. Desperate failure, worthless, pathetic. And then I saw the part that I had not seen, the part that would change everything. The camera, held in my grandson's unsteady hand, panned for a brief and devastating moment, away from his mother and toward his father. And I saw my son Michael standing in the doorway of his office, not angry, not upset, not defensive on my behalf, but smiling. It was a small, tight, and deeply complicit smile. And as Monique delivered her final, most vicious lines, I heard him, my own son, let out a soft but clearly audible laugh. He had not just heard it. He had enjoyed it. He had been a willing and amused member of the audience to his own mother's ritual humiliation. The video was not just proof of Monique's abuse. It was proof of Michael's betrayal. It was the unimpeachable, irrefutable, and absolutely unforgivable evidence that had been missing from my own fractured memory. The doubt, the guilt, the years of self-recrimination, all of it was burned away in the clean, white-hot fire of that one single and devastating image. I was not exaggerating. I was not being too sensitive. I was not imagining things. I was a victim. And now I had the proof. Well, Dorothy said, her voice a low, satisfied hiss as the video ended. That settles that, doesn't it? The video had transformed me. The grief, the pain, the heartbroken confusion, all of it had been transmuted by the ugly alchemy of the truth into a cold, hard, and deeply, deeply empowering rage. I was no longer just a hurt mother. I was a woman who had been demonstrably and publicly wronged. And I was a woman who was now finally ready to fight back. So what's the first move, General? Dorothy asked, her eyes glinting with a predatory light. The first move, I said, my voice no longer that of a victim, but of a woman who was about to go to war, is to call my lawyer. The call to Marcus Thorne was a different conversation than the one I had imagined having just 24 hours earlier. I was no longer a woman reporting a vague and emotionally messy family dispute. I was a client, presenting her lawyer with a clear and legally actionable case of verbal abuse, financial exploitation, and demonstrable bad faith behavior. I explained the years of financial support, the down payment, the car, the endless smaller subsidies. And then I told him about the video. I emailed him the link while we were still on the phone. He was silent for a long and deeply professional moment as he watched it. When he finally spoke, his voice was not that of a sympathetic friend. It was the voice of a lawyer who had just been handed a loaded and very, very powerful gun. Patricia, he said, his voice a low, controlled, and deeply furious rumble. This is appalling. But it is also, from a legal standpoint, a gift. This video is our leverage. It is the proof we need to recharacterize every single gift you have ever given them as a loan, extended under the false pretense of a loving and respectful family relationship. It is the foundation upon which we will build our entire case. He was not just talking about protecting me anymore. He was talking about fighting back. He was talking about reclaiming what was mine. So what do you want to do? He asked. I want to be free, I said, the word simple but carrying the weight of a lifetime. I want to be financially, legally, and emotionally disentangled from them forever. Then that, he said, his voice a quiet, solemn promise, is exactly what we will do. The first and most satisfying step in my liberation was a trip to the bank. It was a quiet, methodical, and deeply empowering act of financial disentanglement. With the counsel of my lawyer, Marcus Thorne, and the moral support of my cousin, Dorothy, I walked into the downtown branch of my bank, the place where the financial history of my life was held, and I began the process of reclaiming it. I sat with the branch manager, a kind, professional woman who had known me for years, and I laid out the situation. I did not have to show her the video. I simply and calmly explained that I was in the process of severing all financial ties with my son and his wife, due to a long and documented history of financial exploitation. The process was surprisingly simple, a series of signatures on a series of forms, each one a small but significant act of rebellion. First, I closed the joint savings account I had shared with Michael, an account he had used as his personal, emergency slush fund for years. The remaining balance was transferred to a new, private account in my name only. With a single stroke of a pen, a decade of his entitled access was erased. Next, I removed his name as a co-signer and authorized user from my main pension account, the account into which my life savings, my 40 years of federal service, were deposited each month. This was the account from which he had been drawing his secret monthly allowance, the money he had used to prop up his own fragile ego. That door was now and permanently closed. And finally, the most satisfying act of all. I instructed the bank to cancel all of the automatic monthly payments that were drawn from my account. The payment for their car, the one I had been making for 3 years. The payment for their home insurance. The payment for their country club membership. A ridiculous, extravagant expense I had only recently discovered. The entire invisible scaffolding of my financial support, the structure that had been holding up their fraudulent middle-class lifestyle, was dismantled in a matter of minutes. With each signature, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I was not just protecting my money, I was reclaiming my life. I was taking back the power, the agency, the control that I had so foolishly and so lovingly given away for years. I walked out of that bank that day feeling not like a vengeful, angry woman, but like a prisoner who had just been granted a long overdue and deeply, deeply satisfying parole. I was free. The first sign of trouble in my son's oblivious, entitled world was, as I had imagined, small. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days after I had closed the accounts. As Dorothy and I were enjoying a cup of tea in her quiet, sun-drenched living room, my old burner phone, the one I had kept active for the sole purpose of monitoring their downfall, buzzed with a text from Michael to his sister. "Hey, did you talk to Mom?" the text read. "My debit card just got declined at the supermarket. Had to put the groceries back. So embarrassing. I think she's still mad. You need to call her and smooth things over." Dorothy and I looked at each other, a slow, grim, and deeply satisfied smile spreading across both of our faces. The first domino had fallen. They were annoyed. They were inconvenienced. But they were not yet panicked. They still believed this was a temporary, emotional outburst on my part. A bit of maternal melodrama that could be solved with a few well-placed and completely insincere words of apology. They still believed that the Bank of Mom, while temporarily closed for a holiday, would soon be open for business again. They had no idea that the bank had been permanently and catastrophically liquidated. The panic, when it finally arrived, was a thing of beauty. It began as I knew it would, with the car. The automatic payment for their SUV, the one that was drawn from my account on the first of every month, was, for the first time in 3 years, not made. 10 days later, a formal and deeply intimidating letter from the auto finance company arrived at their home, informing them that their payment was overdue and that their vehicle was now at risk of repossession. This was followed, in short, brutal succession, by a series of similar and equally unpleasant notices. The power company, whose bill I had also been quietly covering, sent a notice of impending disconnection. The home insurance company sent a letter, informing them that their policy had been cancelled due to non-payment. The entire invisible and deeply fragile financial infrastructure of their lives was collapsing, and they had no idea why. Their confusion, their annoyance, their growing frantic anger, all of it was documented in a series of increasingly unhinged text messages and voicemails, not to me but to Dorothy. They had, in their infinite wisdom, decided that she was the weak link, the soft-hearted old woman who could be pressured or manipulated into intervening on their behalf. The voicemails, which Dorothy would play for me every evening, her eyes glinting with a wicked righteous glee, were a masterclass in the art of the entitled narcissistic meltdown. The first few were wheedling, manipulative. "Aunt Dorothy," Michael's voice would coo, a symphony of fake, filial affection. "I know Mom is upset, but she's not answering her phone. Can you please just talk to her? Tell her she's made her point. Tell her we're sorry. We just need her to turn the accounts back on just for a little while until we can get back on our feet." When that didn't work, the tone shifted to one of angry, baffled frustration. "What is her problem?" Monique's shrill, ugly voice would shriek down the line. "Is she trying to ruin our lives? Does she want us to be homeless? Does she want her only grandson to be living in the dark? This is insane. This is elder abuse. We are going to sue her." The threat of suing the very woman they had been systematically robbing for years was a new and particularly delicious irony. And then finally came the masterpiece. The final, glorious, and deeply, deeply satisfying voicemail that was the culmination of their entire selfish and now spectacularly imploding worldview. It was from Michael, and it was a tirade of pure, uncut, and breathtakingly arrogant rage. "You tell her," he had screamed, his voice cracking with a raw, desperate fury, You tell that crazy senile old woman that she has finally done it. She has ruined everything. My marriage is a disaster, my wife is a nervous wreck, and my son is asking me why the lights won't turn on. And all because of what? Because of her petty, vindictive, and completely insane melodrama. She is not a mother. He is a monster. And you can tell her from me that I am done. I am done with her, I am done with her money, and I am done with her games. We will be fine without her. Dorothy and I listened to the message, a slow, appreciative smile spreading across both of our faces. It was the sound of a spoiled child finally and irrevocably being told no. And it was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. The final act of my liberation was not a loud, emotional confrontation, but a quiet and deeply, deeply satisfying legal document. While Michael and Monique were busy having their spectacular and very public financial meltdown, my lawyer Marcus Thorne was quietly and methodically building an ironclad fortress around my remaining assets and my future. The first step was the will. The old will, the one that had left everything to my son, was shredded. In its place, Marcus drafted a new and beautifully, ruthlessly clear last will and testament. It was a document that was not just a legal instrument, but a final and deeply personal statement of my own hard-won values. The new will left the bulk of my estate, my home, my savings, my pension not to my son, but to a new and carefully structured educational trust. A trust that was established for the sole and exclusive benefit of my grandson, Elijah. I made Dorothy the trustee, a woman whose integrity and wisdom I trusted implicitly. The terms of the trust were explicit. The money was to be used for Elijah's education, his health, and his well-being. It could be used for college, for a down payment on his own first home, for the start of his own first business. But there was one final and beautifully, brutally clear clause. Under no circumstances were any funds from this trust to be commingled with the finances of, or be put under the control of either Michael Williams or Monique Williams. I was not just disinheriting my son. I was protecting my grandson from the poison of his own parents' greed. But the will was just the beginning. The true masterpiece, the final, petty, and deeply satisfying twist of the knife, was the letter. Marcus Thorne drafted a formal and deeply intimidating letter, and he sent it via registered mail to Michael and Monique. It was not a letter from a mother. It was a letter from a creditor. The letter began by formally stating that, due to their documented verbal abuse and a clear pattern of financial exploitation, all informal familial financial support had been and would remain permanently terminated. It then went on to the truly brilliant part. It stated that, given the toxic and non-consensual nature of their relationship as so clearly and publicly demonstrated in the now infamous livestream video, all previous, major financial disbursements, which had been given as gifts under the false pretense of a loving and respectful family relationship, were now being legally and formally recategorized as personal loans. And then it listed them. The $50,000 down payment on their house. The $25,000 value of the car. The letter concluded by stating that these loans were now, as of this date, officially in default, and that a formal demand for immediate repayment was being made. It informed them that if they failed to make arrangements for repayment within 30 days, we would be forced to pursue all available legal remedies, including placing a lien on their home. It was a work of legal and psychological genius. It was a checkmate. They had no money to repay the loans, and their only significant asset, their house, was now at risk of being seized by the very woman they had so casually and so cruelly dismissed as a worthless, desperate failure. The letter was not just a demand for money. It was a demand for accountability. It was a final and deeply satisfying balancing of the books. For 40 years I had been their asset. Now I was their creditor. And the bill for a lifetime of disrespect had finally and irrevocably come due. The aftermath was a quiet and deeply satisfying implosion. Michael and Monique, faced with a mountain of debt, a repossessed car, and a lien on their home, were forced into a messy and very public bankruptcy. Their beautiful, curated life, the one they had so proudly displayed on social media, was revealed to be the fragile, fraudulent house of cards it had always been. Their marriage, a partnership built on a shared dream of unearned luxury, did not survive the harsh, unforgiving reality of their new and much humbler circumstances. As for me, I found a new and much quieter kind of peace. I sold my own now too large home and I bought a small, beautiful condominium in a quiet, respectable building downtown. It was a place of light, of books, of the quiet, simple pleasures of a life lived on my own terms. The foundation for my grandson, Elijah, was my new purpose. I took a deep and joyful interest in his education, ensuring that he would have every opportunity to become the kind of man his father had so spectacularly failed to be. I was not just his grandmother. I was his benefactor, his protector, the quiet, steady, and deeply loving guardian of his future. The story ends not with a confrontation, not with a final bitter argument, but with a quiet and deeply, deeply satisfying cup of tea. I was sitting in my new sun-drenched living room with my cousin, Dorothy. We were looking over the first glowing report card from Elijah's new and much better private school, a school his trust was now paying for. "You know," Dorothy said, her eyes shining with a quiet and deeply satisfied pride, "you are the most ruthless and most loving woman I have ever known." I thought about that for a moment, and I realized she was right. I had been ruthless in the service of my own hard-won self-respect, and I had been loving in the service of my grandson's future. I had learned, in the most painful and most liberating way possible, that the two were not mutually exclusive. I had lost a son, but I had saved a grandson, and I had, in the process, saved myself. The books were balanced. The accounts were closed. And I, Patricia Williams, the woman who had been dismissed as a worthless, desperate failure, was for the first time in my entire life truly and gloriously rich.